a millionaire invited a young black girl, the maid's daughter, to play chess just for his own amusement, never realizing he had just stepped into the most important match of his life. And for the first time, he lost, not because of the pieces, but because of his own arrogance. If you believe that brilliance knows no background and that even silence can speak volumes, hit like, leave a comment for Zuri, and subscribe to the channel to help share stories that stay with us long after the video ends. If someone asked where intelligence is most subtly dismissed, the answer might just be a wealthy man's charity gala. On a golden autumn evening, the ivory mansion of Robert Callahan, a tech billionaire who proudly called himself a champion of underprivileged children, glowed with candlelight, symphonic music, and the laughter of women in designer gowns. The party was meant to raise funds for disadvantaged youth in underserved communities, a title that sounded noble, yet too abstract to touch any real child. Only one person in that mansion truly knew what those children looked like: Naomi Evans, the black housekeeper who had quietly worked in the Callahan home for over 6 years. And beside her was her 8-year-old daughter, Zuri, thin, with tightly curled hair pulled high and deep black eyes that always seemed to be searching for answers where no one else bothered to look. Zuri wasn't supposed to be there. Naomi brought her only because the babysitter canceled last minute. "Just sit quietly in the kitchen and don't bother anyone," she had said. But the kitchen was too loud, and Zuri had never been good at tolerating nonsense. So she wandered off, finding a quiet corner. And there it was, an old marble chessboard sitting in the center of the living room. The black and white pieces stood frozen, like guards between two worlds, one of power and one of invisibility. Zuri didn't touch the chessboard. She just stared at it. So long, in fact, that even Robert Callahan, in the middle of telling a casual story about investment, paused to glance her way. "Whose kid is that?" he asked loudly. His tone wasn't angry. It was a mix of curiosity, condescension, and that peculiar kind of surprise only the wealthy express when something doesn't quite belong in the air. Naomi heard him. She turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. "Oh, that's Naomi's daughter," one guest answered for her, sipping wine with a faint smirk. "Studying the art of chess, I suppose." Robert chuckled, not with humor, but with the easy dominance of someone used to controlling the room. "Come here, little one," he called, lifting his wine glass like issuing an invitation to a game. "Let's see how you folks play chess down in the projects." The room burst into laughter. Zuri didn't laugh. She stood up, walked slowly toward the chessboard, one small step at a time. And in her eyes, in that moment, there was something that made the entire room fall strangely, sharply silent. The chessboard sat in the center of the grand hall, more a piece of elegant decor than a battlefield. The pieces, carved from Italian onyx with silver-inlaid bases, were arranged in perfect starting formation. Not because someone had been playing, but because it looked aesthetic. Zuri placed a gentle hand on the back of the chair across from Mr. Callahan. A simple movement, but it made a few chuckling guests go suddenly quiet. Maybe it was the size of her hand, too small against the towering mahogany chair. Or maybe it was her gaze, not the timid look of a child, but something still and watchful, like a lake before a storm. "You know how to play?" Callahan asked, not quite believing he was about to waste 5 minutes of his life on anything memorable. Zuri nodded. "All right then, you're black?" he said, pulling out the chair behind the white pieces, the side that traditionally goes first. "I always play white, family tradition." A few guests laughed again, this time more softly. Perhaps they weren't so sure it was a joke anymore. Naomi, standing near the edge of the wall, clutched a linen napkin tightly in her hand, not because she feared Zuri would lose, but because she knew her daughter wouldn't be allowed to win. At least not in a room like this, heavy with power. Zuri said nothing. She sat quietly, adjusted the chair, and placed her hands on the table like someone who had done this many times before. One guest, draped in jade pearls, leaned toward another and whispered, "She's oddly poised, like someone raised around books." Robert opened with pawn to e4, a classic, predictable start. Zuri took exactly 2 seconds to respond, with c5. Callahan narrowed his eyes. "Sicilian defense?" he asked, surprise creeping into his voice. A man behind him leaned in to whisper to his wife, "Our youngest is 15 and still doesn't get that opening." But Zuri didn't flinch. She said nothing, just rested her hands on her lap like she'd finished placing the first note in a long symphony. The next 3 moves came quickly. Her bishops and knights rolled out with a balance so fluid, so natural, that some guests began to wonder if she'd just memorized the game. But if it was memorized, why did each of her moves force Robert Callahan to pause, longer than usual? Robert tried to keep his composure, but the deeper into the game he went, the more his polished smile began to slip. The same man who'd once negotiated 9-figure deals was now visibly trying not to lose face against an 8-year-old girl. Then, on move 7, Zuri sacrificed a knight. The entire hall rippled with a strange kind of silence. Someone whispered, "She doesn't know the value of that piece," but someone else held their breath. Or maybe, she knows it all too well. A man standing near the fireplace took a quiet sip of his whiskey and tilted his head. He didn't know much about chess, but he knew enough to understand. Someone who gives up a knight like that isn't making a mistake. They're setting a trap. Robert Callahan frowned. He glanced at the board, then shot a quick look at Zuri, who sat with perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes locked onto the board's every shift, unblinking, unbothered, unapologetic. He switched strategy, brought out a rook, a defensive play. Zuri didn't flinch. She slid her bishop up from the F-file, claiming the diagonal like it had always belonged to her. A textbook fianchetto, precise, deliberate. An older guest in the corner of the room lowered his wine glass and squinted. "She's forming an Indian defense structure," he murmured. "That's not beginner stuff." Naomi heard it. Her chest tightened. Zuri was 8, just 8. But she was playing like someone who'd lived a grandmaster's childhood. No, not a grandmaster's, just a different kind of childhood. In a 1-bedroom apartment beneath the hills of Santa Lucia, where cardboard covered the cracks in the wall to keep out the night wind, and a broken second-hand table became her desk, Zuri had learned to play chess as a way to rise, quietly. Each piece, each position, each defense was how she learned to control a world where she had no power. Robert didn't know that. All he knew was he was starting to slow down, not because she was winning, but because doubt was setting in. Was she just playing on instinct? Or was she walking him into something? "Where'd the kid learn this?" a woman whispered to her husband. "What private academy did she go to?" The husband glanced toward Naomi, standing quietly in the corner. "No," he said softly, "not an academy." Robert hadn't lost a single piece, yet, but he wasn't attacking anymore. Now he was defending. Like a predator who suddenly realizes the prey is looking back. Zuri brought her knight up to h6, corner pressure. To the untrained eye, it looked random, but to anyone who'd cracked open a chess book, it was psychological warfare. Callahan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "She's a smart one," he said aloud, half to himself, half to the room, trying to lighten the mood. Zuri just smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the board. "I play chess the same way I learn everything," she said quietly, every word sharp and deliberate. "No one taught me. I had to teach myself, remember it myself, and not be allowed to forget." Silence fell like a curtain, and from that moment on, the party wasn't a party anymore. It had become a stage, a showdown between an unknown little girl and a man who had never learned to fear intelligence that came from the very bottom. Zuri didn't learn chess because she wanted to beat someone. She learned it because it was the first thing in her life she could control. When she was 5, she found a torn book in the recycling bin behind the neighborhood library, where her mom would bring her during night shifts. The first page was gone, the last page water-stained, but in between were black and white sketches, chessboards, knights, checkmate patterns, and dry, complicated explanations in words she didn't understand. Zuri didn't know all the terms, but something in that book made her forget her hunger. So every night, under the dim yellow glow of a cheap bulb dangling from the ceiling, Zuri copied the boards by hand. She didn't have real pieces, so she used soda caps as pawns and markers to write the letters. P for pawn, K for king, Q for queen. She didn't grasp every rule, but she memorized every move like learning a silent language. Each time her mom came home from work, too tired to even untie her shoes, Zuri would already be waiting at the table corner. "Mom, I figured out if the knight goes here, the king gets trapped." At first, Naomi chuckled politely. But the night Zuri recreated the complex checkmate from page 26, without a single square wrong, Naomi knew her daughter wasn't ordinary. She carried in her something you couldn't teach: memory and quiet determination. Naomi once had a small dream: to enroll Zuri in a gifted program at the private school nearby. But the tuition was nearly 3 months' wages, and when she asked about it, the school director glanced at the form, then closed the folder gently. "Miss Evans, Zuri's a bright girl, but our environment, it's a little different. She might feel out of place." Naomi came home without saying a word. She quietly took the old leather belt from her mother's drawer and shaped it into a queen piece for Zuri. A silent promise: if the world won't open its doors, then you'll learn how to unhinge them one by one. Zuri had never entered a chess tournament. She had never sat across from a coach or seen her name on an official scoreboard. But for the past 3 years, she'd quietly built a world of her own. A world where every move had to mean something, where no one got dismissed just because they didn't wear a private school uniform. And tonight, for the first time, she sat across from someone real: a rich man, a powerful man, a man who thought this game was just a charming way to entertain the guests. Zuri wasn't angry, because in chess, emotions are the first thing you learn to sacrifice if you want to survive past move 10. Robert Callahan wasn't the kind of man who gave up control easily. His whole life had been built around command, of billion-dollar deals, of conversations, of how wine should be poured in a perfect spiral. To him, everything could be predicted, managed, just like a game of chess, or so he thought. But he'd never played chess with a child who had nothing to prove except who she already was. Zuri wasn't just reacting anymore. She was pressing, slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. Callahan's white army was pushed backward. His bishops lost their lanes. His knights were driven from control. His rooks had to retreat for cover. The confident moves he once made now looked clumsy. A guest near the board, Gerard Mason, a seasoned attorney, leaned in, studying the game. "She's doing something I didn't think a child could," he murmured into his wine glass. "She's not trying to win fast. She's making him fall apart by himself." Callahan raised an eyebrow. His rook had no clean path. He tried a check. Zuri blocked it with a pawn, a block that looked like instinct, but he knew now it had been laid 3 moves ahead. For the first time that evening, someone clapped quietly, not to cheer, but out of respect. Zuri still didn't smile. She tilted her head, eyes scanning the board like she was finishing a painting only she understood. Her left hand rested lightly on the edge of the chair. Her right hovered near the knight she hadn't moved yet. A quiet signal. She still had pieces no one had seen. From the corner of the room, Naomi felt a chill, not of fear, but of realization. This room, the one that had once made her bow her head in silence, was now listening to her daughter's silence. Callahan shifted in his seat, fingers tapping the table. The same man who'd once made international CEOs sweat was now seated across from a skinny little girl in a worn sweater with no brand-name shoes. And he was being led. He tried another move, a knight for bishop trade. Balanced, logical. But 3 moves later, he realized he'd been pulled into a positional trap. The moment he gave up the bishop, his left flank opened, and Zuri's queen, long in waiting, pounced like a predator. "God," Callahan whispered, "she's been leading me from the start." Zuri didn't reply. She just looked at him, really looked, for the first time. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with a gaze that asked, "Did you ever believe a girl like me could think?" Robert Callahan had never been the kind of man to waver. But tonight, he was. Not because of the pieces on the board, but because of the quiet way every gaze in the room was shifting. Shifting away from him. No one cared about the French wine bar anymore. No one noticed the violinist playing Mozart. Every eye was fixed on the Italian chessboard, where an 8-year-old girl in a faded sweater, feet swinging gently under her chair, was slowly tearing down the assumptions of an entire room. Robert tried to steady his breath. He still had pieces on the board, but the position, the structure, was falling apart, not from error, from intention. Every gap, every trap had been set by this child long before he invited her to play. In the corner, a woman in a burgundy dress whispered, "She's not just winning, she's teaching him how to lose." Naomi heard it. Her heart sank, not from shame, but from a pride so sharp it almost hurt. A pride she'd never allowed herself to feel out loud, like a luxury she thought didn't belong to her. Robert leaned back in his chair, masking discomfort with forced calm. He scanned the room. The faces had changed. They weren't laughing at his quips anymore. They were watching something they didn't know how to name, a genius. Black, the daughter of a housekeeper, calling check on every unspoken prejudice without ever saying a word. Where did she learn to play? Someone asked. Naomi clenched her hands. A part of her wanted to shout, "Nowhere! She taught herself!" while your kids were begging for new iPads. But she stayed silent, because Zuri never needed anyone to speak for her. The girl had her own language, a language written across 64 squares, whose worth was never dependent on anyone's approval. Robert shifted his knight to the left, trying to patch up his weakening flank. But Zuri didn't strike. She made a different move, not an immediate threat, but one that cleared the path for the next 3. The kind of move made by someone thinking 3 layers deep. Robert began to fear. Not fear of losing, but of not understanding. How could a child like this read him so clearly? How could every decision he made, he, who once ran a global financial empire, be maneuvered by a girl who never sat in a formal classroom? The answer was simple, but hard to swallow. Zuri didn't need to prove she was better. She only needed him to know. He was wrong. Wrong the moment he treated a human being like party entertainment. Wrong to ever believe that intelligence only wears tuxedos, only sits in expensive classrooms, only counts when it comes with a certificate. He looked into Zuri's eyes. That gaze, silent, steady, unblinking, spoke the truth for her. I don't play to be noticed. I play so you never dare to look down on someone again. Mr. Robert Callahan had won many games of chess, on the board and in life, but never one that left him speechless like this. The match had reached move 15. No one in the elegant Beverly Hills room was chatting or raising their glasses anymore. The half smirks had disappeared. The smug glances faded with every move. Now, all that remained was the silence of witnessing something undeniable. Zuri sat upright. She had never been taught how to carry herself in public. But the way her hand rested on the table, the way she tilted her head in thought, the way she moved each piece, made every guest feel. This was no longer a game. It was a real match. Callahan wiped sweat from his brow. Something unfamiliar stirred inside him. Not shame. Something duller, deeper. Like the ache a businessman feels when he realizes he signed a contract with a hidden clause that just destroyed his entire company. And he had signed it on move 3. Zuri slid her queen to d5, an odd clearing move. Hamilton, guest and former Ivy League chess team captain, leaned in. His eyes lit up, the kind of spark only seen when one master recognizes another. "The girl's setting up a third-tier combination," Hamilton whispered, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. "A triple-layer trap. This kid, she's reading Callahan's mind." Some in the room didn't understand a word, but stayed silent anyway. They only knew that Robert, the man who once graced the cover of Forbes, who'd spoken at the World Economic Forum, was now visibly lost on what move to make next. He bit his lip, placed a hand on his knight, then pulled it back. He looked up at Zuri, searching, hoping to see the uncertainty of a child in her eyes. But all he found was one thing: calm. Naomi stood frozen, not from fear her daughter would lose, but because she knew this moment where the wealthiest people in the city watched her daughter in silence, was everything Zuri had dreamed of on all those nights without power, without dinner, without laughter. Just the board. Callahan finally moved his knight, traded pieces. A rushed move, a mistake. Zuri didn't react. She gently lifted a pawn and placed it down. Harmless, it seemed. But Hamilton exhaled sharply. A pincer move. The room rippled with quiet shock. Zuri had just set up a forced exchange that would cost Callahan his most powerful piece within 3 moves. Callahan understood. He leaned back, exhaled, and in that moment, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel ashamed to lose. He felt grateful to be taught. Mr. Callahan stared at the chessboard like it had betrayed him. His queen, the most powerful piece on the board, was trapped. To save it meant losing his king. To protect his king meant sacrificing the queen within 3 moves. No way out. No excuses left. No clever quip could undo the image before him. A small, silent 8-year-old girl quietly rewriting the definition of genius, one move at a time. The banquet hall remained still. Only the ticking of a distant grandfather clock could be heard. Zuri didn't move. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't rush. She simply waited, not for victory, but for the response of an adult. Callahan raised a hand to his forehead, rubbing gently. He knew exactly what this was. He, A man who once manipulated real estate markets across 3 states, who dismantled 4 corporate alliances with a single meeting, was now being outplayed by a child. And worse, he deserved it. Because he had started this game, he was the one who first said, "The maid's kid? Why not let her play for fun?" Now, that little fun was teaching him a lesson that settled deep in his chest. He inhaled, long and slow, then placed his index finger on the white king, steadily, gently, and tipped it over. The room froze. Some thought he was joking. Others couldn't believe their eyes. Zuri simply nodded, not surprised, not proud, as if she had known all along. If he had the nerve to start this game, she would finish it, gracefully, without humiliation. Naomi brought a hand to her mouth. Her eyes were wet, but not from victory, from the simple, overwhelming truth. Her child had been seen, not as the maid's daughter, but as a full, worthy human being. Callahan rose slowly, and then did something no one expected. He turned to face the guests and said, clearly, "I just lost a chess game, but the biggest thing I lost tonight was my arrogance." No one laughed. Then he turned back to Zuri and with a slight bow said, "Will you teach me how to play? From the beginning." Slowly. A strange hush fell over the room, as if something heavy and invisible had just been washed away. Zuri gave a small nod. "Yes, but you have to promise not to underestimate quiet people." Callahan let out a laugh, real for the first time that night. "I promise." The next morning, Naomi and Zuri's small Bronx apartment was buzzing in an unfamiliar way. Not with the usual chaos, no neighbors shouting, no sirens wailing down the block, but with chimes of incoming messages, the landline ringing non-stop, and a stack of handwritten letters pushed through the mail slot, so many that Naomi thought someone had made a mistake. One of them was from the president of the National Youth Chess Federation, a man Naomi had never heard of, but the neat handwriting and respectful tone made her sit down to read. "We would like to formally invite Zuri Evans to compete in the U10 National Championship. All travel, lodging, and coaching expenses will be covered, because genius should not have to wait for a scholarship to be seen." Naomi was stunned into silence. Zuri, meanwhile, sat on the floor, replaying last night's match with her bottle-capped chess pieces. "What are you doing, baby?" Naomi asked. "I'm redoing from move 7. I think I went too fast. Mr. Callahan probably could have lasted 3 more moves." Naomi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. What she didn't know yet was that the story of last night's chess match had already spread like wildfire online. One of the guests, none other than a state senator, had posted a photo of Callahan tipping over his king with the caption, "Last night I witnessed a beautiful defeat and an 8-year-old mind that made me believe in the future." The post reached over 300,000 shares in just 12 hours. Within a single day, Zuri Evans, the black girl, the housekeeper's daughter, had become a new symbol of borderless brilliance. And then, that afternoon, Robert Callahan himself arrived at their tiny apartment. No assistant, no bodyguard, no driver. He knocked. Naomi opened the door, stunned. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, sleeves rolled, no tie. "I didn't come to ask for a rematch." Zuri peeked out from behind her mother. She was still wearing her worn sweater, holding a broken plastic knight in one hand. Callahan smiled. "I came to ask if you'd like to help me build a chess school." Zuri blinked. "For who?" "For kids no one notices. Kids who've only dreamed of having a real chessboard. Kids like you." Naomi couldn't speak. Zuri lifted her chin, her eyes more serious than her age. "I'll say yes, but only if you learn with us. From the beginning." Callahan let out a real laugh, for the first time feeling something like peace. "Deal." And that late afternoon, as the last sliver of sunlight slipped through the tiny window of a ground-floor apartment, one game ended, but a far greater one began. A game that would quietly rewrite how the world defines intelligence, origin, and the true worth of a human being. 1 year after the fateful chess game at the Callahan estate, the old warehouse on the corner of 183rd and Maple, once a dumping ground for construction debris, had been repainted, fitted with windows, and adorned with a carved ebony sign. Zuri House, a chess school for the forgotten. Naomi still worked, but she was no longer a housekeeper. She was now the executive director of the center, leading a small team of chess instructors, psychologists, and community educators. And Zuri, the same little girl from that night, had become a living symbol. still in her simple sweater, her hair tied to one side, her deep, steady eyes. But now, every weekend, she taught chess to dozens of other children. Kids from Bronx shelters, temporary housing, undocumented immigrant families. Kids who had never seen a real queen outside of a TV screen. She taught them the way her mother had once taught her, not by starting with the rules, but with a question. What's something you've been looked down on for? A shy girl whispered, because I can't read. A boy mumbled, because my parents live in a car. Zuri nodded. Then let's play chess, because on this board everyone gets the same chance. And Callahan? He kept his promise. Every Saturday, he came to class with the kids, relearning from square one, starting with E4, remembering how knights move in L shapes, occasionally getting checkmated by Zuri halfway through snack time. But he never looked embarrassed. In fact, he often said, I used to think being the best meant knowing everything. Now I know being good means still being willing to learn. A journalist once asked Zuri during a live TV interview, what changed your life? That chess game? The fame? Or Mr. Callahan's support? Zuri just smiled softly and replied, no. What changed my life was realizing I didn't have to be loud to be heard. The host fell silent. After that episode aired, hundreds of letters poured into Zuri House from all over, Alaska, Georgia, New Mexico. Kids wrote by hand, with misspelled words in ink that smudged. Thank you, Miss Zuri. Because of you, I think maybe I can be smart too. Zuri read every single one, and she wrote back to each child in her own crooked handwriting. Of course you're smart. People just haven't looked closely enough to see it yet. The room where someone once thought Zuri was just the housekeeper's daughter was now a classroom. On the wall hung an old photograph, a little girl in a worn sweater placing her final move. And beneath that picture, in Callahan's own handwriting, were the words, sometimes genius arrives unannounced, and only when we're humble enough to lose do we truly win.